Dr. Jazz.
I wanted to start this talk
Dr. Jazz.
by asking you what's happening on the department of band leading, and the last one I heard. I mean, I love the trio with Chris and Tyshawn that you had years ago, and I really found the last one completely unexpected. Even though I know you started with George Lewis, I want to touch that, and Anthony Davis, like with the MIDIs and computers. But that's like 5 years ago, and I wanted to ask you,
Yeah.
have you been preparing something new or writing new stuff or?
Yeah, so it's a great question. The Department of Band Leading, I love it. I'm gonna use that. Um, so yeah, I do a bunch of different things, and that's both my what I love about what I get to do, and it's also a challenge because I'm spread in a lot of directions. So band leading, I've definitely had it on the back burner for in the traditional sense of band leading, having a band and putting out the record, going out and touring, playing gigs, and being the leader of it in particular. Like that's been a super. I did that a lot for a bunch of years in there, and then I sort of like you said, around it was slowing down after that record got made, and then around 2018, 2019, I just kind of really put that on the back burner. I actually was doing some gigs out here as a band leader around 2019,
Mm.
and then and I had all these plans to actually ramp that up uh, around then, 2020. I had but then the pandemic hit,
Yeah,
and it wasn't strictly the pandemic that caused my plans to change, but um, well, a bunch of things happened, and I'm now working on an album, and it's different. It's not with the trio. It might involve Dan and Chris, um, but what in short, what I've been doing the past like 4 years more as a composer has been continuing this thread that was also going before of these telematic
hmm
multi-site kind of things, concerts. So we've done a few big ones of those, but I haven't been, my composing and band leading definitely slowed down a lot the past 4 years. Part of it was that when the pandemic happened, um, like I said, I had all these plans, and like everybody, they got canceled.
yeah,
Whereas a lot of musicians kind of went into like, okay, I'm stuck at home. I'm gonna make a bunch of records, Like, I mean, I know you did that. A lot of
oh yeah,
people just made a lot of
yep,
records, right? During the lockdown. I didn't do that because I was sort of swept into kind of helping people make records and helping people play gigs online because, and helping I'm an academic. That's the other piece of this. I'm a full-time professor. So both the musicians communities that I'm part of and the academic community that I'm part of in my department and beyond, everybody suddenly needed help
yeah,
doing networked music during the pandemic. And this was something that previously, I mean, I'd been doing it for 12, 13 years at that point, but we never anticipated doing it under those conditions, doing it from home. And honestly, we never anticipated anybody giving a shit about it because for
yeah,
12 years we'd been doing it and nobody gave a shit about it. Like nobody cared. I mean, I don't want to say that it's not quite that extreme. We got,
but yeah,
we got people come out to our concerts. We got a little press here and there, but most people were like, "Why do you guys do that? That's so weird. Why would you want to do that?" Like, and I mean, I can answer that question later. It's not to replace in-person music, but we can talk about why we do. I mean, it's a lot of interesting reasons to do it, but we
yeah,
we weren't doing it to prepare for the pandemic. We didn't know there was going to be and we were also not doing it in that way. What we were doing, starting like I've been involved with it since around 2007.
oh,
Um, we were learning how to put on concerts with multiple with like a band in in each place that
Yeah.
forms a larger band. Like it wasn't about everybody sitting in their bedroom playing together. We didn't want to do that. We had like stages where you'd have four musicians and then another stage with four musicians in another place and live audiences in both places. We also did things like where you would beam in. I'm sitting in my office. I'd beamed into a million concerts like in different places using the same tech, but that was sort of like a side thing. What we really were focusing on learning how to do
Mm.
and still do is to put on these concerts where we're joining audiences and musicians from multiple locations, because there's some really interesting potentials with that artistically, environmentally,
Yep.
even just collaborating, rehearsing, having long-term collaborative relationships with people in faraway places where you might fly there to do the gig, but for the 3 months beforehand, you could rehearse every week, And so we were exploring these tools because we thought they had a lot of potential, but we recognized that number one, nobody really cared much about it because it was it was kind of hard to do at that time. And all those years, it was not easy. It was like you had to code things, and the software was not as good as it is now. Um, and you also needed really good internet quality, which up until just before the pandemic was not really possible at home.
Yeah.
Most of the years we were doing it before the pandemic, home internet connections weren't good enough. But then when the pandemic happened, so literally overnight in spring 2020, I went from having all these gigs lined up and plans to make another album with the trio and all these things. Suddenly, like my phone was ringing off the hook with people trying to get me to help them. Like, how do I run my
Set up things. Yeah.
jazz combo class in the fall online? How do I do a concert? How do I make this record with people? And I just felt like this kind of responsibility because we'd been working on this for 12 years to help people out. But also I had no idea because we'd been doing it in university spaces with high-end audio
Yep.
equipment and good internet connections and like production staff support. We'd been working that way for a dozen years, and suddenly everybody was at home with their crappy little computer speakers, and like we're like, so the first thing we had to do, and especially I did this with my friend Mark Dresser, the bass player. We
Yeah.
just like dove in. And so we were like, okay, well, we got to figure this out immediately. Like, can we do it from home? Because we never bothered before.
Yeah, so you did stuff. Yeah.
We never had a reason to do it at home. So we spent like 2 months just researching how to do. We called everybody we knew, and I knew, we already had networks of, like, I knew the people that built the software that existed, and things like Jack Trip, and it was great, but it was really hard to use. And so we were immediate, and they were incredible. This whole community of software developers, everybody was in the same position. We were all
Yeah.
trying to help people out. And so we spent a few months like just furiously trying to get the tools kind of like more usable by people and testing them out. I made a bunch of videos. Just like that summer was just like this flurry of, we got to figure this out for people. And it was just, and then the whole next year, it was like a 1.5 year cycle for me of just like being absorbed with this work. And then, so I could, during that whole time, I was like, well, my composing it can wait, I mean, like, I've
Yeah.
put out records. It's not like I can put that on the back burner. So it was really a couple years before I could even get back to my own stuff fully, because that just took up and also I was in my department where I teach, people needed support. Everybody wanted to know how to do lessons online. It was just like I spent all my time becoming this sort of network support person. And it was really interesting, and it felt really rewarding because, it was actually very powerful to see how many people stuck at home for that, especially that first year and a half.
Yeah.
It really, I'm sure you experienced this, but it really made everybody realize how deeply important it is to interact musically. And it just brought out this deep sense among, everybody I knew of how,
Yeah.
we suddenly, things that we took for granted, that just being in the same room together playing music. And it wasn't like we were trying to say, look, we can replace that. Just stay in your bedroom. We can make it work. We were, it's not the same thing. No one
But it
ever
helped.
said it
It
was.
helped.
But what people were able to do, I mean, there were so many powerful events. Like, I mean, lots of gigs where we were able to get really low latency, good audio quality, stream a concert over Zoom. it's not ideal, but or people recording projects together. I had a grad class I ran with some graduate students who were all really good improvisers. We made a record together, and just to sort of like that class, we spent 10 weeks like rehearsing several times a week in different subgroups, and then we recorded a big record, like a session of, it was all open improv, but kind of like building on 10 weeks of collaborative sessions, just to see that kind of thing. And then all kinds of projects, to see like, wow, what it brought out of people was really powerful. And,
Mhm.
So that was one sort of almost 2-year detour for me from composing. And then as I came back into, as we all came back, the other piece of it maybe is just that I didn't, I do have a bunch of music that I was writing even back before the pandemic that I'm now trying to get into a record. But I got to a place where I was doing some of these big projects. I was also telematic projects, composing for those. I was also working a lot more on sort of community engaged projects and different kinds of teaching. And my university is going through, like all of them now, higher ed is in crisis. And I got
Yeah.
sucked into all kinds of stuff here. I'm chairing my music department. I had to take over running our jazz program because someone retired. I'm doing like all these different things to try to help. So like for me, I was just the past 4 years or so have been like, there's been a lot of stuff where I feel needed, and I haven't had as much time as I'd ideally like to have to like get that next record done. And it's hard because in the jazz world, as you know, there's like this kind of heavy, for good reason, there's a sort of a gig mentality, because this is music that if you're not out there playing a lot
Yeah.
live, you're not growing,
Yeah.
And so, and also, just like any music field, people feel pressure to produce. So I always feel like, oh man, I got to get out and do a tour and lead a band. It's a part of me, but then I have all these different teaching, mentoring students. Students went through a lot during the pandemic. I had to really like put aside some of my own work to focus more on mentoring and helping students get through stuff like that. And so now I feel like I'm finally kind of coming back, but I'm also uh, taking on a lot at the university, because kind of helping in administrative work here, helping to shape opportunities for other people to do their creative work has also become a big thing for me.
Mm.
So I appreciate you, noticing that I'm, I got some work that I need to get back out, and and it's slowly coming back. But I was actually about a year ago, I was starting to get back into this rhythm, and a year ago I was gonna be recording this album, getting back on tour, and then I got hit with chairing this music department again, which has been like a total job for the last nine
Sure.
months. So it was just like, it took me out of it. Now I'm trying to get back into it again. I'm still chairing, but I'm trying to, kind of contain it. So it's been a lot of things, but I miss playing with, those guys in my trio, with other folks in New York. I have had some really great experiences though through these telematic projects. Like we did a wonderful concert in the winter with it was one of the few big things I did this year, but with Faye Victor and
Mm.
Ingrid Laubrock and Patricia Brennan, and they were in New York, and Mark Dresser and I and Joshua White
Oh
and
wow.
um, Gerald Cleaver were here in California. We had like a septet concert with them. We did another one with Korea with the same band here. And so things like that pop up that are really amazing and fun, and I get to write a big 20-minute piece for that. So I've done some things like that that have been, it's just not very, in the jazz world, it's not like you can't put a 20-minute piece out and on a record. It's just like, and I mean, even that was on my last trio record. That was
Yeah.
just so non-radio play friendly. It just didn't, and I don't put much time into promoting these things. I don't spend much time on social media, but that record was so abstract and so kind of like some long tracks that take a long time to kind of evolve, and it's just not, it's sort of in this fringe area, so it's hard also to get, it's kind of hard sometimes to figure out how to get, and maybe that's the final thing I'll say to answer your question, is that the record, the scene has been changing. I'd be
Oh,
curious to hear
absolutely.
your thoughts on this, but the
Absolutely.
band leading, if you talk to anybody who's been leading bands for like 20 or 30 years, they will tell you it sucks right now leading
Yeah.
bands. I mean, it's not you, unless you're part of the 1% in the jazz world, which is like literally 30 people who are, you know, who are, if we're talking about people making their own original music, like really focused on composing their own music, there's a small sliver of people who can really make a living from doing that. But it's
I agree.
very
Yeah.
few. And even when you talk to them, I got these friends and who, who do pretty well in that world, they will complain and tell you it sucks. I
Yeah.
mean, they are getting, they're like looking at academic jobs, looking at, and a lot of the money funding records and tours and promotional stuff now is coming from, honestly, from sort of either people save up money
Yeah.
from other income
True.
sources, or there's a few really wonderful, wealthy people who support it, and no one really knows much about this. It's not spoken a lot about, but there are some sort of like angel investor types who make things happen, and that's fantastic. We need them.
Yep.
But the infrastructure in the jazz and kind of creative music, for lack of a better word, field for making records and tours happen is absolutely gutted compared to 20
I
to
agree.
30
Yeah.
years
Yeah.
ago. And it's just completely not a sustainable model. So that's also a factor for me, because I kind of feel like, on the one hand, I have a family. I don't have money. I can't afford to like drop 20 grand on a record and
Yep.
tour just for the vanity of it. I'm not going to do that. And I don't get a lot of money from the university to do those things, a little bit, but I'm not at one of those, that's another thing. Some schools are wealthier and you can get good money from them through your teaching gig, but that's rare too. And so I have to figure out how to pull this kind of thing off. It's sort of a puzzle. But the other piece of it is that if I do get the money, like I've saved up some research grant money here and there, and if I've saved up a little money from, family stuff, I can maybe cobble together some money and put out an album. That's what I'm
Yeah.
hoping to do. In the next year, get another kind of, I'm working on like a sextet, septet album, want to get done. But even if I can do this, for me to like go out and try and get more money to tour it and promote it and get on social media and do the whole thing, I feel like it's almost kind of ethically wrong for me to do that, because I'm a tenured full professor. I have a salary from the university. I don't, I can put out music and get it out there, and if people want to hear it, they can
Yeah.
find it. But I don't have a great personal need to be increasing my visibility a lot. I know that, I should, as an artist, you want your music to get
No,
out.
no, but absolutely.
But I'm
No.
not like,
Yeah.
I'm not, it feels almost like if I take up the tiny little bit of oxygen that I could in that space, then the people that are not, supported by like a university gig like me, who are trying to get that gig, I mean, it's just ridiculous, man. If I go to New York, I can get a door gig playing at like whatever, I mean, I've done that a million times, playing at places like Barbez or
Barbassi or
I-Beam
whatever.
or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
I can go there and play I-Beam, but it's not supporting me to do that. The door is not doing that. Who's paying for that plane ticket and the money I got to pay my side people? That's the university's paying for that. So what about the guy down the street who's trying to get that gig
Yeah.
and, doesn't have any income? I'm not saying I'm going to leave the scene just because I'm a tenured professor, but I'm saying I have to factor in these things. I feel like it's kind of like it's a weird thing to have to think about. And I know if I say this to some other people, because there are some very well-known jazz stars who are tenured professors, they don't think about this at all. They're out there like they're milking all angles, and they would say, just do it, no problem, and so some people don't worry about this at all. But I kind of feel like I just need, everybody's got to find the angle that works
Niche.
for
Yeah.
them, and
Yeah.
I feel it's a little weird to be just going to New York but on the other hand, like I said before, if in this music, as you know, it's not like being a classical composer where you sit there and you in your little studio for 3 months writing a big piece and you send it to someone and they play it. You got to be out doing it.
Yeah.
So that's why for all those years, especially when I started out in this academic job, I started the trio. I mean, I would fly to New York. I would write a grant, get some money, fly to New York, pay these guys. I would lost money every time, man.
Of
I mean,
course. Yeah.
I don't think any of those trio records, I didn't even break even. I was using grant money to pay for them. And then, I can't sell CDs. I didn't make
Oh,
back
yeah.
the money on that. So like, it was always a losing venture, and I'm not someone who's great at like going out and getting well known. So if I got gigs to play a festival here and there or something, it was just like recouping losses is I'm not making money as an artist. And I say this because I think any, young artists, they don't always know this. They see you out there and they think people are just making. So I'm saying this because if there's someone watching this who's 18, 20, 22 thinking, how do these people make it work? They don't, man. Some of those
Yeah.
folks who are like, on the cover of Downbeat, whatever, are barely making any money from that music. Some of them do well. I mean, I'm sure there are ones who do well,
Sure.
but not everybody is making their money at selling at the streaming and the performing and enough to like cover all the expenses that career
Yep.
requires. A lot of them supplement that with all kinds of other income
Teaching
sources.
care or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
and or private investment. It's almost like, but it's. I feel like we need more openness in the community around this because I see a lot of young. I mean, I teach, and and these undergrads, they come in and they're like, they just assume that and it is possible. I don't want to say it's impossible, but they look at people and they just have no idea how the economics of creative music work. And I'm like, it's complicated. It's not, it works a little differently for everybody, but it's not what it might seem. And 30 years
Mhm.
ago, like in the 80s, even into the 90s, it worked differently. You could
Yeah.
go, I
Yeah.
mean, I think it started to shift in the 90s from people I
Yeah.
talked to. I wasn't touring really then, but I have friends who were touring a lot in the 70s, 80s. They would go to Europe and they would say, like if you lived cheap in New York and had a bunch of bands and played in a bunch of bands, you could go to Europe on a 2-week tour, come back and pay everybody in the band, have a bunch of money in your pocket, and they
Yeah.
would do that through the year and make good money. But the travel has gotten more brutal. Anybody will tell you that travel sucks now compared to back then. And the fees are lower in Europe. They're hiring more European musicians, so there's not as many gigs for Americans going over there and just is not as many gigs, period. And
Yeah.
so it's a whole nother time. People I know who maybe like, I guess they're nearing, I mean, I'm 50, what am I? I'm 57. Is that right? Yeah, I'm 57. But I know people in their early 70s, right, who toured like that
Yeah.
decades and that's how they made a living. And now they're looking at me like, how do I get that job you got? How do I can't make this work anymore, and I don't have a retirement pension, and
Yep.
I'd like health insurance, so I think these things are important to talk about for younger musicians. Even though I know I should go back to the music. You want to talk about music? We
No,
could
no,
do
no.
that.
But
But
I absolutely agree with you because it's
yeah,
true. It's like now if you're a band leader in the music that we play, let's call this modern or creative jazz or whatever, not straight ahead
right,
jazz. But even straight
right,
ahead jazz is the same. If you put out an album or 6 in a year, maybe you can set up in Europe a 10-day European tour. Maybe you can do that.
yeah,
That's the
yeah,
reality. If you're
yeah,
not like you said, the 1%.
right, right.
But
And
that
it's
tour
also
doesn't pay for anything. It pays
well,
like,
it doesn't, and it's also
you
like it
know,
depends on your life
so
circumstance. Like I had one friend, I remember Marty Ehrlich, my friend
yeah,
Marty, saxophone, but Marty said at some point, touring now, it's a young man's game. He said,
yeah,
if you're like 25 and you can all just jump in the van and drive around and sleep on people's floors, you could do an East Coast tour and make a little
yeah,
money. I mean, but man, when you're like 40 and you got kids and you got a mortgage and like what the hell, it's like a different world. You
it
can't.
is, yeah.
So it really is like it's a real reality check for a lot of young people when they see certain signs in particularly the media, because it is possible still to get press and to, that's
Yeah, but you have
changed
to
too, I
invest
guess
money to get press
but
as
you
well.
got you got to invest
Again,
money
you're
to get good press, right?
exactly so.
But even if you get press, I never really had the money to do that, so I never bothered to invest in that. But I know how that works. I have a lot of friends that do it. I only
Sure.
did it once in a tiny way, but I've talked to enough publicists to know how that works. It's not even a guarantee, and it's super expensive. I
Yeah.
mean, it costs like, you know, I mean, I don't know
Oh,
if you probably know about this stuff, but I mean, you got to spend a good like 4 or 5 thousand
yeah, yeah, a
dollars to
couple of
get a
thousand,
six
yeah,
month
if you want,
to
yeah.
get a 6 month kind of press a publicity package from someone to get your, and then what'll that give you? It'll give you some better quality reviews than you could get on your own by just doing the hustle. But
Exactly.
now I don't even know. I mean, now with social media, if you talk to publicists, they'll tell you that it's a different game too, and
Yeah,
they're
it is.
what they can get for you is has dwindled down too. And so the publicists will, will be very clear that like it's not like it was even 10 years ago. They can't get you the same kind of things that they could have gotten
Yeah,
you because now everything is so driven by social media. And if you're not out there on social media really hitting it, they can't do much for you. So it's such a game, man. I mean,
I know it's yeah.
I'm kind of reconfiguring. Then I'm just trying to. I think we're all just trying to find a meaningful way to be part of a scene and to get our music out into a community and that's why this kind of thing that you're doing is very important because even if you're not attracting thousands and thousands of people, all these small scale grassroots things that people have done. This is to me that and having studied the history of kind of avant-garde, whatever you want to call it, creative music, this kind of thing is central to that history.
Yeah,
Self-published things,
absolutely.
grassroots organizations, people just getting something out there by any way they can, all of that kind of work of community building outside of the and I'm not saying we should ignore the mark. I mean, go for it. If you can have a great Instagram followers and you can get on the festival, do it, man. That's great. I'm all for it. But having kind of a kind of a grassroots built community is also
Mm,
very important for this music. The lifeblood of the music is depends on that existing too. It's not it can't only be supported through the more commercial, mainstream, industrial kind of
absolutely.
structures of media, of venues, and it's the same for venues. I mean, I'm all for everybody should try and get their gig at the Vanguard or whatever, but if we don't have places like iBeam, we're not going to have a scene. And so
Sure.
it's a whole ecosystem, and I'm also very invested in how academic institutions and academic programs can be part of that ecosystem productively, which they haven't always been great at, but they are part of it, and they need to be more consciously and better and creatively part of it to support it, because the scene of more risk-taking, creative, original music needs all the support it can get. And
Mm,
so wherever your skills are, you can contribute to that. And so what you're doing is important. People in academia trying to build new things, that's important.
yeah.
People in trying to start their jazz club and get a grant is important. People trying to run Chamber Music America and get more jazz people grants in there, it's important. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem of all these different things, and often people are kind of like fighting about which one matters more, but I kind of see it as like just wherever you feel like you can get something creative to happen and get some cool people opportunities to get their music out into the world, just go work there. Just get, some people are better working with a big nonprofit, some people go into teaching, some people
Yeah.
just
Yep.
tour and make a living on the scene, trying to get on the downbeat profile, whatever. I mean, whatever your thing is, find your place and figure out how that puzzle of making a living works, because you know, so that's kind of the message I'm trying to get across to our students now, because and it's hard because they don't always know. They're just like out of high school. They don't know where they fit. They don't even know
Sure.
what they want to do, let alone how they're going to fit in and what part of the scene. But as they come through the program, and some of them are into like, wow, I really want to write my own music and get out and tour and be a jazz musician. I'm like, okay, who can I connect you with? I got an alum who, he's a great jazz pianist. He plays with Arturo Sandoval and Jane Monheim. This guy Max Hamer, he's great. He came out of our jazz program years ago. Go talk to him if that's your world. Or maybe
Mm,
you want to make more experimental music. Let's talk to some people who figured out a way to do that. Maybe you want to go into tech and learn how to code and work for an AI music company. I know someone who does that. Let's get you over
yeah.
there. Maybe you want to become like a nonprofit executive director someday and like run a jazz organization for community building. Let's figure out, there's like all these ways that people can like move into the world and do something kind of cool and creative. So I think we need to better kind of like overview somehow for
Mm,
people, for students to, or just young people, not even just students, but people to kind of see, oh, okay, I love this music. I love jazz. but how do I connect the parts of it that I love, the kinds of jazz I love, the things about jazz that I love, the things I do, whether it's playing, composing, and teaching, that I love. How do I connect that with some actual ways to make a living? That's kind of where I'm at right now. I'm really trying to
Mm,
think about this with other people. We're all talking about it all the time because, you know,
yeah.
and I don't mean to like derail the conversation from music. We can go back to talking about music, but it's funny because every time I get an artist to come, you'd be surprised, man, how many times, and I hear this from other people at other schools, artists come in, you know, you got your friend who's the guest artist, they come in to do a master class or something for your students, and the students, often the conversation goes to, okay, how do I make a living with this? Like, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
I had
Uh,
someone told
it's
me
valid.
at
Yeah.
Cal Arts a couple years ago, I think it was Vinny Golia told me that he brought in someone to do a master class for the students up there, and all they wanted to talk about was how do you make a living? How's your career worked out? You know, because they're like, okay, I'm not so I mean, creative music, I want to hear about your music and your composing too, but like, how do we make this work, you know? So it's an urgent kind of, and it's only been exacerbated by the pandemic when,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, it's everything just that was kind of traumatic. Everybody's gigs just
Yeah. Yeah, that's a different.
evaporated for 2 years, you know. So it really made us all feel vulnerable, and a lot of venues didn't come back. We lost like the
Yeah, yeah.
Blue Whale, and I mean, it was so tragic to lose the Blue Whale in LA, this kind of jazz club that had been LA's sort of central site for everybody, straight ahead jazz people, avant-garde people. I played free improv gigs there. I played all kinds of gigs there with all kinds of people, and like suddenly it's just gone. You know, it's just like, so there's hope. Things are coming back, and you know, but it was just it was sort of this big hit, you know, and so I think we're all still trying to kind of make sense of it.
No, no, it's like all that you're saying makes sense because when I do these interviews, you know, I do them because I love the music, obviously, but also to talk about things like what you're saying now, you know, like many artists, like people who are in their 70s, let's say, or older, or even younger, for a matter of fact, like are questioning the idea, you know, what's the idea of an album nowadays,
Yeah,
or like you know, I release nowadays like 5 albums a year because, but it's not only to, it's just to document where I am at my
right,
artistic life
right.
because I teach for a living. That's what I do as well, and
Right.
so
Yeah, I
for me,
saw
it's
you're
just
incredibly productive, man. I saw the number of albums you're putting out with the range of people too. And
yeah,
that's
but
I you know, when I saw that I thought, okay, this is a certain model of practice that you can actually trace it back. A lot of people, I mean, you know, in a way, going even back to the 60s, there were
mm,
people, you know, starting like around Braxton's time,
yeah,
and you
for
know, people
instance, yeah,
just put
yeah,
out tons of record, and especially in the 80s when it became a little bit easier to record, 80s and 90s, you see people just recording a lot, and that's a like I was saying, that's a way to stay creative,
active, yeah, yeah,
and to
yeah,
just sort of say it's not like you're trying to make that hit record every time. You're just
yeah,
documenting, you know.
yeah.
So yeah, that's
That's
a
my.
way to be in the world, and it's cheaper now to make records, you
Oh
know.
man, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
like you know, I've done so many records long distance with even I still kept doing them. We are still doing them after COVID because it's
Oh,
easy.
good.
You know,
So
like connecting.
how are you doing those? Like, what's your approach? What kind of tools do you use to? I was
Uh,
curious about that.
I mean, I just like recorded my studio here at home, and then we sent each other wave tracks, or if
So
it's a
it's multi-tracking.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and
Well, you know,
it saves
if
on
you,
travel costs and everything, you know,
yeah,
on plane
yeah,
tickets, on studio time, and
right,
it's not the
totally.
same, like you said, being in the same room, but still, you can be really creative with it. It's not a substitute,
Totally.
it's like just an addition, I'll put it like that,
Yeah,
to what you do. But
exactly. Well, you know, just as a quick thought, and for anyone listening, um, I didn't, I was talking earlier about the pandemic and the network, you know, what happened. One of the silver linings of all that flurry of interest in network music during the pandemic was that a whole lot of people came into the space of software development, and
yeah,
suddenly the tools over about 2 years, and even since they're still evolving, but over the 4 years, past 4 years, the tools for this work have gotten so much better and easier to use. And so if you're interested at all, it's actually really, really easy now. The I have a page on my website where I recommend 3 apps, but the one that I'll mention that I definitely recommend checking out, it's called FarPlay,
Oh
and
yeah, we did that
it's I don't
with
know.
Dan
Do you
Tadford the
know
other day.
Dan? Yeah,
Yeah,
you know
yeah,
Dan, right?
yeah, yeah.
So
We talked the
Dan,
other day and we tried it,
so
and yeah, it's
yeah,
perfect.
it's Dan and Anton built this incredible app,
Yeah,
and I've been, I've known him since because he was one of these people who had never cared or thought about it, but then the minute pandemic happened, he dove right in because he's a coder, and he got involved with. So I, saw him in that Jack Tripp space, and then he and Anton split off and built their own thing, and they kind of rebuilt it from scratch. They built an amazing
that's
app,
fantastic,
and
man.
if all you need is a decent home internet connection, but you need wired internet. You can't use Wi-Fi.
Yeah,
That's the thing that throws people. But if you have a wired, if you can just get an Ethernet cable and an Ethernet adapter, plug in your computer that way, turn off the Wi-Fi, and if you can use a pair of wired headphones instead of, you can't use Bluetooth headphones,
yeah,
you're good. You can play up to about 500 miles. You can play in
that's
time with
crazy.
people. You
Yeah,
can
yeah,
play anything. If you're in New
crazy.
York, if you're got someone down the East Coast a bit, you could play anything. And you can even play, it's so fast now, um, that, Dan and I did some tests and we played a ballad and it was fine. It's only when you play up-tempo tunes across the country that the general rule is about 500 miles, you can play pretty much anything. But then
Yeah,
after that, you start to feel it. But even at 3,000 miles, we could kind of play a slow tune and it worked. So it's really I mean, I would say just, yeah, keep making albums that way. Why not? And then when you can afford the plane tickets and getting
exactly,
together, do it.
exactly,
Or
man.
rehearse
Sure,
that
yeah,
way. I'm doing
sure.
a project right now where, or I've done many where I rehearse with people at a distance, and then we get together and we play. And we've been rehearsing without having to drive that hour and a half, it's just not worth it.
Saves time and money and everything.
So
Yeah,
yeah. So if you can get it set, and once you get set up, after that, it's just plug and play. It's just like turning on Zoom. It's no big deal.
yeah,
So yeah, I'm glad you're still doing that, but I do think it's going to change some aspects of how we can work together, but it's not a silver bullet. And we need a lot more things to change
oh
in
man,
our
yeah, yeah.
scene.
It's
So,
yeah,
but
especially in creative music. I mean, that's one
yeah,
major issue.
yeah.
Yeah, it's quite problematic actually.
Well, I mean, maybe it always has been. It's not like it's
That's
ever
also true.
been.
Yeah,
It's not, it's not like there was ever a moment where maybe there were better paying gigs at a certain point, like we've been talking about earlier, but it's always been a hustle to make your own original music work.
yeah,
And so that's not a new problem, but I don't know, with the current economic pressures, the political problems in the world, the environmental problems, it just takes on a kind of new
different.
layers of challenge.
Yeah,
But I see hope in the young. I mean, so many young people doing amazing stuff. It's just incredible how much music is
yeah,
happening out there.
yeah.
So yeah, that was a long answer to your first question, but I'm working on a septet record. I'm working on some telematic projects. I'm working on some kind of community-based, socially engaged sorts of projects around Latin America and the border here and things like that. And so there's a lot of
Beautiful.
different things happening, but I appreciate your interest in my music. It's not, I don't spend a lot of time pushing it out there, so this kind of came out of the blue, but thank you.
No, I mean, I also did a couple of records for Clean Feet. So, I Pedro gave me a lot of records of Clean Feet, and I bought many of them. So that's
Yeah,
why
great label.
years ago I stumbled upon, your stuff, 2008 already. That one, Between Shadow and Space, I think it
Right.
was. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's like 16 years ago already. But
Yeah, I mean, and the range of music you
yeah,
cover on your thing here, the number of people you've interviewed and the kind of, it's like, yeah, it's incredible how much
yeah, I
it just
love it,
shows
man.
it shows how much is out there. I mean,
Yeah.
like I
Oh,
just look over your list, I'm like, wow, there's so many people, doing, and also a label like Clean Feed. I mean, I get his catalog, I see, wow, there's all these people in Europe,
yeah,
2/3 of them I've never even heard of,
yeah.
and they're
It's
doing
insane.
amazing stuff. It's
It's
just like,
insane.
how do you even sort through it all? I don't know what you do, but it's just there's only so many hours in the day to really listen to music, and there's
Yeah,
so much music going on out there.
true.
Uh,
Yeah,
but it's exciting times.
it is. Yeah. Michael, I wanted to ask you, like, what's your connection with Yusef Lateef, actually? Because that's like, uh, a bizarre one. If if I look at someone where you're now musically or what you've done, and then it's Yusef Lateef there, like how did that
Yeah,
begin for you?
he was a very important teacher for me. He was teaching at the University of Massachusetts Amherst,
Ah, okay.
uh, and a couple other colleges around that area. There's like five colleges in that area. And I had, I went to a music school. I went to the Eastman School of Music when I was just out of high school. That was like
Okay.
in the 1980s, a very long time ago. Um, and I wasn't even like a jazz major. There was no jazz major there. It was just we all had to be classical majors, but there were jazz courses because they had a master's in jazz, so we could
Mm.
take the courses. So I had, some. I mean, I had classes there in jazz. It wasn't like I was great uh, at it when I finished, but I also had become when I graduated from Eastman, I had like, the bachelor's of music and performance and whatever. But by the time I graduated, I had gotten super fascinated by all these different kinds of music, non-Western. I was into listening to Indian classical music, West African music, electronic music, avant-garde kind of composers, underground avant-garde pop, rock music, like, just like experimental stuff from the 60s and I mean, I was just into like everything and early music and classical music. I was just like all jazz, of course, all kinds of jazz. I was all over the place. I had no idea how to put any of this together.
Mm.
We were just like my friend, we would just listen to all this music and be blown away by all the different things out there, And I loved it all, but I wasn't because of the nature of that school, there was no like community. The teachers were just straight ahead jazz, classical, There was no one there to say, hey, you should move to New York and find this group of people around John Zorn or whatever and go find your people. I had no idea there was even a play, and I wasn't much of a city person either. I was just like, I just want to make great music, but all these things were fascinating to me. So I'd heard of Yusef, but I spent about 5 years. I left music and spent about 5 years doing other things,
Oh, wow.
other kinds of jobs. Um, I spent 2 years living in a Zen Buddhist monastery in California. I worked on
Oh.
a farm. I was a dishwasher. I got married to a Venezuelan and spent a half a year living there with her and fell in love with her. And so, but eventually, like 5 years after getting my music degree, because my wife was studying at Hampshire College in Amherst, I ended up moving there. And I had been outside of music for like 5 years, just trying to
Mm.
figure out who I was, Still, I mean, carrying my trombone around and playing, but not really making a big living at it and not just doing other things for a living, totally, and not on any scene at all. And so when we got to Amherst, I worked actually for a year with people um, I worked as a direct care worker for a mental health agency. I just needed to make a living. So I was just working a job, And then I found out that Yusef was teaching at UMass Amherst there, and I was sort of, mid-20s, sort of thinking, okay, I got to figure out what I'm doing in my life. Like, maybe I'll go back and go back. I knew I wanted to go back to music. I just didn't know how. And they had a master's in jazz composition. I didn't want to do a
Mm.
master's. I had no interest in doing a master's degree, but I found out Yusef taught there. And I thought, I want to study with Yusef Lateef. I'd heard his music. I was like, man, this guy's deep. Like he was like in his 70s at the time. I thought, okay, I want to study with Yusef, and I guess I'll do a master. What is it? What does it mean to? I had no idea. What does it mean to do a master's degree? So I applied for I wrote him a letter. This was pre-internet, So I wrote him a letter in the mail because somebody gave me his address, or I found him because he was teaching actually a class at Hampshire College where my wife. I literally ran into him like in the parking lot. I said, "Oh my God, Mr. Lateef, I love your music. I want to study with you. How do you give lessons?" And he said, "I teach at UMass Amherst. They have a master's degree there. I teach composition there. And if you want to, So I wrote him a letter, and he wrote me back. He said, "Yes, you should contact the, you know." So I applied, and they gave me like a TA ship that paid about the same amount of money as my crappy job. Like, my job was meaningful, but the pay was terrible. And so I thought, okay, I'll go study with Yusef Lateef and TA some theory classes instead of like, working for this agency and working myself to death for minimum wage. I'll go do
Yeah.
that. And that kind of got me. So I literally sort of stumbled into academia with no idea. I mean, I knew actually what academia was like because my parents were professors, so I wasn't like
Mm.
academia was new to me, but they weren't in music, and I had no idea what like I'd gone to a conservatoire. I didn't know what it meant to do like a master's degree in music. I didn't, but I just wanted to study with Yusef, and I knew that I could get 2 years of private composition lessons with him if I did this master's, and that they would pay me to TA these theory courses. I thought that sounds cool. Let's do that, see where it goes. So that got me into academia, and I've been there ever since. I mean, and so
Mm.
because Yusef was so deep and incredible, I mean, just the lessons with him were amazing. He really gave me, and that's why I started talking about all these interests that I'd left Eastman with all these interests, but I had no idea how to kind of put it together. And it's not like I know that now, but Yusef gave me a model and a sort of a way of thinking about music that was totally different than anyone had ever given me. He sort of introduced me to what we would probably call creative music sort
Mm.
of philosophies or approaches, but he didn't use that word, but and he didn't use the word jazz. He didn't like that word. He didn't like the word improvisation either because he thought it meant you were just making things up with no preparation. And I asked him once, why don't you use the word improvisation? He said, every time I pick up my saxophone, whether there's sheet music in front of me or not, I'm drawing on more than 6 decades of preparation. And I looked up the word in the dictionary, and it said that to improvise was to do something without preparation. So I don't think it's the right
Mm.
word. I was like, just things like this would just like blow my mind. And so, I mean, he was incredible. And just watching him integrate composition, improvisation, and technology, integrate approaches from classical music, from African music, and other kinds of traditions across the world, and of course jazz, even if he didn't like the word himself. Just the way that he integrated all these different things just blew my mind. And
Mm.
so to work with him for a couple of years was really transformative, and that kind of got me some sort of foundation of a practice myself, just thinking of myself as, okay, this is what it means to be a creative artist. You can do this. You can integrate all these approaches and traditions, and then from there, after doing that, I taught there for a year, and then I found out that George Lewis was teaching
That's how
at
you connected to George. Okay.
UC San Diego across the other side of the country. But George had just started a PhD program there that sounded really exciting because it was like all about experimental kinds of approaches to music, but also thinking critically about music and looking at scholarship on music and culture, and that was becoming interesting to me. I would always been interested in kind of philosophy and things like that. Um, and also
Mm.
seeing Yusef, and I mean his situation there, he was not, uh, I want to say, particularly rewarded the way he should have been by the academic system. It really opened my eyes up to the fact that I was really lucky to study with this incredible master musician who, there weren't a lot of people like him from backgrounds like him teaching in programs like this. And he was a
Yeah.
part-time adjunct underpaid faculty member the whole time I was studying with him. Only at the very end, right before he retired, did they give him a full-time job, and that was just to sort of save face in the last couple of years he was there because he was 80, you know. And but it was incredible to see him in the institution and think, wow, I'm so fortunate to study with this person, and he's giving me this incredible like creative guidance and mentorship, and he was super kind, and really, I mean, just an amazing person. And then I saw George starting this program. I thought, okay, academia. I mean, I hadn't had any plans to become an academic. That was not, when I was at Eastman, that was the last thing on my mind. I just wanted to get good at making music. But when I saw, okay, Yusef, I had this amazing experience. And then George is starting this
George. Yeah.
PhD. Wow, I could spend a few years working closely with George Lewis, and they similarly gave me a TA salary and a scholarship. I didn't have to pay anything for it. I had to do a lot of part-time jobs to
Yeah.
cover the rest of my bills and stuff, but I made it work by just gigging a lot and on the side, and 4, 5, 6 years, whatever it was, doing the PhD. I got to study with George Lewis, and then you come out at the end with a PhD, and then you're like, where do I go? How do I get a job? There's not many jobs. So I lucked out eventually after several years of part-time and visiting jobs. I finally got a tenure track job. So it's a long kind of arc, but
Yeah.
those two, and Anthony Davis was also teaching at UC San Diego, the two of them there. So I was really lucky to have, Yusef, George,
They're
Anthony
amazing. Yeah.
as close mentors. And it also it I know a lot of people on our scene, they hate academia, they bash it, and for good reason. I mean, like, there's a lot of very insular academic programs that are
Yeah, yeah,
just
yeah.
like, just the people hiring their friends and kind of keeping their little circle of people, and it's not what it should be,
Yeah.
ideally. And like any institutional culture, there's problems, but I had this amazing experience through these two graduate degrees of getting to study with these just phenomenal, brilliant three people, all whom are, Black American men who are associated with these very experimental kinds of practices, and they've all done well in their career, um, but it wasn't an easy pathway for them to get into these schools. So I
Yeah.
finally got through with all those years of training at the grad level, and meanwhile, I'm TAing all these classes, learning how to teach, learning how to do scholarship, think critically about culture, learning how to write and do research and all these things, and composing more and developing my own practice more. And so, that was a long kind of arc of many years of just getting to a place where I felt like I had some kind of foundation for both my artistic practice, but also by the time I was finished with all that, I felt like I understood a lot more about how academic institutions worked and what was the potential there, like I was lucky to have this great experience, but also all the problems, all the challenges, all the things that could be done better. So it left me feeling unlike Eastman, where when I got out, I just wanted to get as far away from schools as possible. Like the last thing I wanted to do was go to any more school. I was just like, get me out of school. I want to go out and be a person now. And I was just sick
Mm.
of school. When I finished my PhD, I was like, I need a tenure track job because now I've invested all this time and all this training, but I can also see how these systems can work better. They can support students better. They can bring new faculty in who are underrepresented. They can expand in new areas, and we can, like, our scene needs people doing creative kinds of research on it. We need more books about cool things. We need more
Yeah.
people support. Why are all the composers who were tenured in academia writing certain kinds of music and not others? Why are people from our creative scene not better represented in this institutional culture that is part of the kind of art institutional matrix in our country, or whatever, complex? It's like it's part of it, part of that ecosystem. So I kind of had this renewed sense when I finished all that of like, if I can get a tenure track job, not only is it good for me, I can help support my family and, have a salary and that kind of thing, and also get to make my music, but teach and mentor and build programs but do things that are transforming the institutional space. So, when I got here to UC Irvine, I had some really good colleagues. We started a new PhD, back then MFA, but now it's a PhD program called Integrated Composition, Improvisation, and Technology.
Mm.
So I see, and we've had just all these great people come through it, and it's not like a panacea for the problems that are out there, and to some degree it just adds more people with PhDs that need to then get jobs, right? So it's a challenge, but on the other hand, like we're trying to build these spaces where we can actually, somehow figure out how to create space in these
Yeah.
institutions for people to do things that are transformative, that are really creative, imaginative, innovative, and that aren't just replicating the same kinds of cultural practices that have always been supported by these places, but opening that up, expanding it a little more broadly to opportunity. And so that's been a big part of my life, and it hasn't just been like I need an academic gig so I can get a salary so I can run
Yeah.
around the world and tour and put out my records. It's not it's actually it's more than a day gig, it's kind of a meaningful set of potentials to work with. And that's why you know, I'm willing sometimes to take on all these roles, like, okay, I can coordinate the jazz program or start this new grad program in something cool or help run the music department, because I feel like there's potential in these institutions. They're
Definitely.
they have an important role to play if we do them right, but they're also just, full of problems and historical legacies of just exclusion and narrowness of thinking and, all kinds of things. So they're just another site where we can work at those challenges, you know. So
Yeah.
so Yusef was really important to me. I mean, it
Mm.
was a real turning point for me from in mid-20s of my life, just kind of being someone who just had all these creative interests to like, oh, well, here's someone who just did that. He was so amazing. I mean, he combined it all. He was like writing
Yeah.
symphonies. He had gone to Africa for years to do work. He'd done all this research on, he was open to new technologies. He was, so I think I wrote about this in the liner notes to my last trio record that as I was doing that record, I realized that it might not sound like his music, but structurally, in terms of the thing I'm trying to do of bringing together composing, improvising,
Right. Yeah.
technology, and not seeing this hard wall between when we're free improvising and when we're composing, like that story I told about him and the word improvisation. To me, the spirit of that story is very much, and his approach, and I mean, he blew me away with it. I got to play on one of his records early when I was studying with him, and he just had this ability to
Right. That's with
kind of,
Adam Rudolph. Yeah. Yeah. I know.
yeah,
Yeah. I
he had
listened
this
to it. Yeah.
ability just kind of like things he would prepare materials, and then he would go into the studio, and the studio was kind of like this alchemical space, so he had actually, I remember that record, he had asked Adam to record a bunch. At that point I'd never even met Adam, and Adam was living in California, and I didn't know him yet, and so Adam recorded on DAT tapes. Adam recorded a whole bunch of tracks in his studio, sent it to Yusef, and so I show up, and it's like, I'm getting out my horn, warming up in the studio, and Yusef is just queuing up some tracks to get the sound levels right, and I hear it, and I'm like, wow, that sounds great. He's like, you want to play with that? I'm like, yeah, sure. And so I was like, I didn't know I was coming in here. I didn't know what I was coming in here to do, but he just said, you like that one? Yeah, okay. So I play over a couple of these tracks, and he records me improvising some things, and he's like, all right, now he pulls out some staff paper, and he asked me to play some things, and he gives me a kudu horn that he brought back from Africa, and I play some things he wrote, and he multi-tracks some things. And I'm like, all right, that was a
Wow.
fun session. I don't know and then the record comes out, and he's like, he took my improvisation over Adam's thing, and then he layered all these other things over it, and it's like this otherworldly space.
Mm.
It's amazing what he did. He just had this ear for like, and I think, when people talk about like Miles in the studio, where you think about In a Silent Way or tracks like records like that, where he could just get people in there and have them he just knew how to get people to do stuff that was amazing
Yeah.
somehow, and he just saw it as like, these are the ingredients. Now I'm gonna put it together, and so that creative use of the studio, Yusef had that. He could just hear these connections, and then it was incredible what he did. But he also would bring in like notated, like a little page he'd written out with some little
Wow.
things on
Yeah.
it, and he had me do it, and then maybe he'd change something, have me do it again. So I was learning by also working under him and seeing, wow, you can be composing. You can compose before the session. You can compose during the session. You can compose after the session. It's a whole, it was just a way to kind of model his creative practice, or just to see that as a model for me was really
Mm.
powerful. And also his kind of philosophical mind. Most of the time in our lessons, well, half the time we'd be talking about like intervals, and half the time we'd be talking about you know, the nature of reality. I mean, he would just go all over the place. So it was really beautiful, and it just gave me a wonderful kind of foundation. So it was very
Mm.
important for me. Yeah.
How did that help? You mentioned academia before, and you followed that path. And how was it then for you when you started leading bands? Let's say you made a trio then with Chris and Tyshawn, the monsters, crazy, amazing geniuses, and with Dan Weiss later. Was it easy for you to start leading bands, or how was
No,
that like?
well, yeah, that's a good question. It was,
Coming from a slightly different angle, maybe even.
yeah. I mean, band leading. Band leading. It. I wouldn't say it's easy. I mean, band leading is a whole art and craft in itself in our zone, especially where it's very the music is so improvisatory
Yeah.
and it depends so much on the people, right? I guess I started leading bands around the time I started studying with Yusef when I started leading some bands then, writing for bands, and then in the early 2000s I was really involved with a quartet where we were sort of called Cosmologic. We had a lot
Oh
of
yeah, with Jason.
um
Yeah.
yeah,
We
with
talked with Jason
Jason,
about it the other day. Yeah.
Jason and Nathan
Yeah.
and Scott. We had a
Yeah.
we ran that band for 12 years, and then by the end we were all just in all these different parts of the country and directions. So we it didn't it lasted about a dozen years, but we put out 4 albums. We toured Europe once. We toured the U.S. a bunch of times. Real scrappy tours, that kind of thing. Young man's game, right? Like I said earlier. So that was a great experience, and leading some of my own bands during those same years was a good experience. But in San Diego, in Western Mass, um, so I was probably leading bands for around 10 years in that sort of way with just whoever was around, kind of like in my late 20s, early 30s, like whoever. And I had no money. It was just like, I'll be in your band, you be in mine
Yeah.
kind of thing. It was, we were all just in that space, right? And when I got this academic job in '06, and by that point I actually started my trio with uh, Jorge Roeder, a bassist who's
Yeah.
wonderful,
Yeah.
who's you probably know, and Bob Weiner, a drummer who's out in Western Massachusetts. When I was living in Amherst, the second time I was living there, but in like early 2000s, I started a trio with them. That basically my trio, because I had this idea. I wanted a really compact, thinking about affordability too, like you know, using the electronics as a kind of a color to not substitute for harmony, but to take that kind of function
Hmm.
of giving more space than just acoustic trombone bass drums would be. So, and I was really interested in integrating electronics, live electronic processing and sampling into my music. So I thought, and finally, processors on computers were getting fast enough to do this. So around 2003, I started the trio, and we did some gigs with that trio with Jorge and Bob, and and I had a few years with them, just kind of working out what I was doing with that particular band. I mean, I wasn't new to band leading, but with that format. Um, but when I got this job, I suddenly had access to a bit more money because I had a real job, so that was when I thought, okay, and I also moved to California. I was no longer living near Bob and Jorge,
Mm.
and. So I thought I had a chance to sort of, okay, the rhythmic stuff in particular that I really wanted to also be at the center of this work, because had been deep deep in that, but I was still not, I mean, I'm still am, but I wasn't at the place I wanted to be with it. But I knew that in order to get, like, I'd been studying, practicing, working on all these complex rhythm things, since the late 90s, but with various bands and on my own, all kinds of stuff. But I knew that I had a lot of growth still to do on that. I still do. Had even more back then. And I knew around 2008 that the only way I was going to really like push myself to get to the next level with both that band, to really get that trio's music to what I wanted it to be, and to get better myself at
Yeah.
playing that kind of music with these, complex rhythmic structures, was to hire people who were better than me at it, to really hire these like super badass people. And so, um, I forget how I think I knew of Tyshawn at that point. Tyshawn was actually, you know,
Yeah.
really, really early in his career. He had started playing with Vijay, and I go way back with Vijay, so I knew Vijay. I heard Tyshawn on, I think it was Blood Sutra was
Oh
maybe
yeah,
the
with
first
Rudolph.
record that he was on with of Vijay's, and I heard that band play maybe, I don't know, 2003 or so, 2004, somewhere in there. And I went to some event. I was on some panel with Vijay, and they played. And I met Tyshawn. Tyshawn was an undergrad at that point. I remember him telling me about some paper he had to finish that night after the gig. And he was just like, I mean, he was like, I don't know, 18, 19 years old at that point. He was just this unreal player. I mean, even then,
Yeah.
just the level of playing was just like oh my God, I couldn't believe what he was doing on Vijay's music. And, you know, Vijay was kind of reining him in that energy and getting him to work in that band. And it was unreal what they could do. And so a few years later, when I got the gig, the academic gig, I thought, okay, I need to take this trio doing that. So I got in touch with Tyshawn. He said, yeah, I'll make a record with you and do a few gigs. And because he was still, you know, kind of not as famous as he is now, right? Um, and I asked him for bass player recommendations, and he said, "Oh, I know this great bass player, Chris Tordini." So I thought, okay, if you're recommending the guy, so I hired them. We made a record. We did some
Okay.
gigs, you know, and they completely kicked my ass. I mean, they were like younger than me, but these guys were just ridiculously
Yeah.
good. And so like playing with Tyshawn was just insane. I mean, he just completely kicked my ass, you know, and made me realize, wow, I got a lot of work to do on this, you know, but it was incredible. And I listen to that record now and I think, wow, I mean, I just, you know, I could do it a lot better now, but
That's
it
a
was
great
just like,
record.
wow,
It's a beautiful
that
record.
I hear myself, you know, both on the compositional level and on the performance level, just trying to get this music out, you know, but he just is incredible, and both of them too. I mean, Chris too. You know, so playing with them really just totally opened up like this whole new thing for me. Like, wow, I can play with people at this level, and
Mm.
like that was amazing, you know. And so, so then Tyshawn was starting after a couple of years. You know, Tyshawn was starting to get really busy with all these bands, and there was some point at which I needed to make the next record, and I couldn't, you know, get him to pin him down for some dates or something, and he just, you know, he was really busy, and so I instead asked Dan Weiss to play on the next one, and I think we went to Portugal and played
Yeah.
a gig and made a record and whatever, you know, so then I started working with Dan after that, and the next three trio records were with Dan. Chris stayed in, and
Yeah.
I mean, Dan's totally different player, different sound, different everything, but equally just
Yeah.
mind-boggling
Rhythmically
drummer.
amazing.
You know, just
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
just insane levels of skill on the instrument and on rhythm, and just like improvisationally. But what really I found so powerful about both those guys as drummer and about Chris, um, and what I was really looking for specifically, and this is, I guess, to your question about band leading. For me, like part of band leading is really having clarity about compositionally, what are you trying to do and who are the people you need to do it. And because it's really goes back to that kind of, in a way, that Ellington model of
Ellingtonian model. Yeah. Yeah.
writing for people rather than instruments. But to the extent that I did have a kind of it's always a little bit of both, right? I wanted bass, drums, trombone, electronics. This was the sound, and the trio I wanted was that. It wasn't just like any instrument would do. So I wanted a drummer and a bass player who could not only play the most, I could just hand them rhythmic stuff that was insanely difficult, and they just devour it. Like they look at it, and 5 minutes later, they not only can play it, but they can improvise over it.
Yeah.
That's, you know, they can
That's
just like
crazy.
open it up. And not only can they improvise over it rhythmically, which is now, I would say now, you know, nearly 20 years later, that's a little bit more established in our scene as a skill set. There are a lot more drummers now who you give them like something in
Yeah.
11 and they can just blow over it, no problem. They can play a solo all day. But that's not all I wanted. I wanted drummers, and a drummer and a bass player who could also improvise in other ways with sound, you know, with who I could say, okay, we just did a piece with this crazy groove and that like, but now we're going to do a piece where like it's about space and
Yep.
sound, and I want you to be able to just like work with one sound in great depth and interact very spaciously, or I want to be able to give you like a graphic score and have you do something really meaningful, and then I'm going to give you a score with a whole bunch of little fragments that are in 11 and 17 and 39 and whatever, and then you got to make sense of that. And I wanted people to have that range of skills because that's what I was trying to go for compositionally, and they could do that.
Yeah.
They were masters at doing. They could do, you know, the ears that these guys have. So like Tyshawn, Dan, Chris. I mean, and now, you know, I could name many other people,
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
course.
So,
But the skill to be able to take those sort of traditional rhythmic, harmonic, melodic kinds of ways of playing and to be a virtuoso at that, but then also to be sitting in the tour van talking about Stockhausen or talking about Feldman or talking about, you know, the production techniques on that original Jamaican mix of the Bob Marley and the Wailers album compared to the later one that they redid. You know, I mean, these are things that these guys just have ears that are just so attuned, and they have such a wide range of reference points for their musicianship
Yeah.
that they're not just like badass drummers, you know. And so this is also something that was really important to me, to have people that had that kind of range of creative capacity and vocabulary and ears. And so it was such I still feel like just getting to play with folks like that. And then, you know, in the years since, so many people, because band leading is important to me, but I love collective projects, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
and being able to collaborate. And I love being in bands of other people. Like I've played a lot with my friend Mark Dresser.
Yeah, I
We've
wanted
done
to ask you
so
about
many.
Mark.
Yeah, Mark is, I
What's your
mean, you
story with
know,
Mark, actually? I mean, I love Nourishments, that one with Rudrush, and then the Seven, and those records are fantastic. I mean, Mark's one of my favorite composers and
yeah,
bassists. But like,
no,
what's your
Mark's,
story with Mark, actually? I mean,
well, Mark and I, over the years now, we've been playing together for like, I don't know, over 20 years, but,
mm,
um, so we've become really close friends. I mean, he's nearby. He's probably one of my closest friends and collaborators, but partly because we've done all these telematic projects, but also
yeah,
I've played in his bands of all sizes and shapes, and you know, he's played in some of mine, and we've done a lot of things. And so, you know, so yeah, I mean, Mark's a dear friend, and um, but and I would say, you know, you you learn about band leading partly by playing in other people's bands, right? So playing in Cosmologic for all those years was really powerful for me as a way to learn about band leading, because we were a quartet and three of us composed. So when you came in as the composer on you, and we would always, you know, every set had compositions from all three of us, you know. So when you were leading the band on your piece, you were the band leader. But when when,
yeah,
when Jason or Nate was leading their piece, I was the side per, you know. So but so you kind of like I learned a lot about band leading and being in bands from that experience, and then playing in bands with people like Marty Ehrlich, Nicole Mitchell, so
yeah.
many
You've done a
people.
lot, yeah.
You know, I mean, all these people, when you play in their bands, you see how they lead the band, and everybody, you know, everybody leads bands from their personality,
Yeah, yeah,
from their way of being in the world, you know. So, and often with these people, you're in their band one day and they're in your band the next day. That's the way our scene works, right? So I love that part of it. And so with Mark, it's been all combinations. We have duo project too. We're trying to
oh,
finish
really?
up.
Oh, wow, beautiful.
We've been playing duo for so long, telematically, because he lives about an hour away from me. So rather than drive, we like practice once a week together from
Mm,
our offices. We just turn it on
that's
in there together. We
fantastic.
play. Yeah, I mean, it sounds great in here. I don't want to drive all the way down there.
Yeah, yeah,
And
sure.
he's so close, we can play anything. So we're working on a bunch of new music, trying to get it recorded soon. And
Fantastic.
you know, and so we've done. But I love his music. It's so fun, and it's really it's super unique. You know, it's got all the stuff I like, because it's got all these really interesting sort of formal qualities of rhythm and sound and timbre and harmony and melody, but then it's also really open. And he, you know, as much as he gives you these complicated scores, he also
Yeah,
wants
yeah.
you to kind of like just you got to be yourself, and you got and he comes from that. And I would say, you know, Mark is one of a number of people from that generation who I've been fortunate to kind of work with or study with. They were all born in there's a certain thing here, people about 15 years older than me. They were all born around 1952, or, you know, Marty Ehrlich, Mark Dresser, Anthony Davis,
Yeah.
George Lewis. There's a whole bunch of others. Um, and then there's other people like Nicole Mitchell passed through my program here. She was on our faculty, a close
Mm,
faculty colleague, and she and I were playing in Mark's band a lot. I was playing in her band a few times, and you know, she played in mine a few times. So I learned a lot from watching Nicole. Myra Melford and Nicole were both very involved with
yeah.
all these telematic projects that Mark and I did. So the four of us were on a lot of telematic projects from out of San Diego that we did a bunch of times. So I got to play a lot with Myra and Nicole through that, and Mark, and you know, and then through these telematic things, I've gotten to work with all kinds of people who were sort of heroes of mine, like we did a concert with a couple times with Oliver Lake, and people like
Mm.
that. And it's like, wow, I got to play on one thing with Ikwe Mori and write a piece that had her on it. And, so it's like, it's not like quite like being in their band, but these
You see
projects
it, yeah.
we've done of this telematic, because we've done so many of them where we're just like, okay, we're going to do a telematic concert. It's going to be between these two places. And then we get everybody together as a flurry of rehearsals and a concert. And we've done a ton of these, and I've gotten to play with people in different parts of the world that way. We've built these connections with folks in Korea. So band leading has also extended into that space for me. It's actually a really interesting kind of thing. I don't think I've written much about it. I started an article I haven't finished yet, but about like taking this band leading model from our kind of jazz and creative music type world, taking that into a telematic, telepresent space where you have multiple musicians in different locations playing together. It's a really interesting thing to do because the ways that we're used to band leading are very
Yeah.
interactive, and when you do it in that space, you can really kind of learn something new about that space, but also that space gives you a new way of kind of doing it,
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so,
Yeah.
so that's been really fascinating. And on these projects we've done, I don't know if band leading is the right word because it's usually the format Mark and we've done a lot of these where we set up usually a couple groups, sometimes three, but often it's two, like the one I mentioned between San Diego and New York we did last year, where we'll say, okay, there's those three musicians in New York, like for that gig, Ingrid and Patricia and Faye were in New York, and Mark and Gerald and Joshua and I were in San Diego. And then we say, okay, who wants to compose a piece? And if you want to compose a piece, compose a piece. So we had like uh, Ingrid and Faye and Mark and I composed pieces, so we put on a concert, and it's kind of like a new music concert in that
Yeah.
there's a bunch of different new pieces, but these are all people coming out of jazz-based traditions, and it's very collaborative. I bring my piece in, people have all kinds of things that it's responding to them. They're doing, it's band leading, but it's kind of like Cosmologic. We're sharing the composing, we're sharing the band leading, and then we generate this concert. And we try to record it and document it if we can. And so it's a different kind of thing, but I think that
Yeah.
it's been a really it's been a it's been a super educational process for me over now 15 years or more of doing those kinds of concerts, because I get to work with all these interesting people, sometimes people from other traditions like Korean, you know, music, and kind of transpose band leading into a new kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
format, a
It's
new
way better.
space.
Yeah.
It's like a
Yeah.
transposition of band leading skills. And so Mark and I also have co-directed a lot of those artistically, where we have to interact and direct things like the lighting designers, the projection designers, decide how to set up the space, how many rehearsals can we manage, how can we make it where I technically direct it, you know, how do we prioritize this place's quality of sound over the fact that if they don't use headphones, it's going to be some bounce back on our sound. How do we, there's a lot of artistic and technical direction that we've learned too. So kind of directing those concerts as a producer type has also
Mm.
been it's a band leading type work, and I've learned how to kind of produce these multimedia sorts of events. But I realized halfway into that like I was actually drawing on my band leading skills, because you're directing like lighting designers and set designers and network music specialists. You're directing all these people the way that you would direct a band.
Yeah.
You're like
Yeah.
it's all about this. You have to let people do what they're good at, and you got to listen to them because they're going to tell you stuff that And I guess it's not new if you're coming from like a theater world. That's what directors do. A good director or a film director. They're responsive to everybody, from not just the actors, but to the set designer, the sound designer, the lighting designer. They're having to direct. But coming in the music world, I didn't have any experience with that kind of thing, and so we had to sort of learn that. Mark and I had to kind of learn this, you know, on the fly, on the gig, like how to get all those people to work together to produce this event while also interfacing with the musicians as composers, as performers. So that whole world has been really interesting to me, and a big part of what I've done the past 10, 15
Yeah.
years. It's just not it doesn't get much play in the jazz press and you know, they're just not, they don't know what to do with it. It's not like we're making records and playing the festivals. We're doing these weird concerts to them in academic spaces. And the part of the reason we did one with Roulette last year was we wanted to try to extend into venues that made
Space,
more
yeah,
sense.
venue,
You
yeah.
know, they weren't just like a university like concert hall, but like Roulette, you know, it's a place in New York where people go to hear a concert. But it's hard because they're not set up to do this kind of thing. So they were great. The staff there were wonderful, but they're not, just the space
Yeah,
itself is
that's
not well designed for it. And so it would, like, to really make it work well, we would need more time and money and staff and, you know, to kind of get the best we can out of it. They did as good as they could with what we had. But, you know, the question of how to make this work for our field is one that Mark and I are actually still, we're trying to work at. You know, our we'd like to be able to, for example, why can't we have a gig where there's a jazz club here and there's a jazz club in Berlin or New York or wherever, and the band is split between these places and we're making some amazing music happen, and you know, there's audiences in both places enjoying it, and we don't have to fly, you know, to your,
yeah,
or we could do a tour where we, like, there's say three of us here, like a rhythm section and a horn, and then we get like another horn player to show up at the gig in Paris or Berlin, and they're there in person, so it's not like just audience sitting there watching us on TV. There's someone live there performing, but they're hearing really good quality sound and they're seeing really good quality video in a really immersive
yeah,
high-end environment where they can still have their beer and be at a club and enjoy the gig, but like we're throwing down and it sounds and looks great. There's no reason we can't do this except money and time. And if we were, you know,
yeah.
in the popular music field making where there was more, there's more, you know, they can afford to do this, but you know, they scale up and they want the stadium gigs. But we could do this for the small, intimate kind of performance environments that our music requires. And we would just need money and people to back us and get it to happen. And it's hard because club owners are like, why would I want to? I don't want to do that. Like you know, I got people who will come here in person, and that sounds like a lot of extra work. And I don't know, I don't even have an Ethernet cable, and you know, so it's like it's a hard. But we feel like 20 years from now, it's going to be happening. It's
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like you
definitely.
know,
Yeah,
it's not, you know, there's no reason we can't be doing this. I mean, it's going to happen eventually when the stuff gets cheaper and easier. We just want it to happen sooner so we're not dead, you know, and we can take advantage of it. And we see a lot of potential here, you know, for also I think there's an environmental angle. Like flying
yeah,
to
yeah,
Europe,
yeah.
man, to play a few gigs, it's just it's obscene. I don't even feel good about flying to New York anymore. I mean, I have to say, like, I flew to New York last summer to play the Vision Festival with Mark's band, and I I struggle with that decision, man. I mean, 5, 10 years ago, I would have just sure, like, I'll go play the Vision Festival. I mean, it was a gig where, you know, my flight's paid by them, the hotel, I just fly out, play the Vision Festival gig, fly home. Fun gig. I make a little money. It's a great band. Cool. You know, last summer I almost said no. I'm like, I'm gonna fly all the way across the
Yeah, yeah,
country, burn all that
yeah.
jet fuel, so I can play to you know what, a couple hundred people in roulette and play a cool gig, and that's great, and I have a great time, and it's meaningful. But like, what
I know
is
what
the
you mean.
environmental impact of that? That is like just obscene. Like, there's all these great people in New York who could have played that gig instead of me. Like, why? You know, I don't, yeah, it just felt to me like this is really kind of decadent in a way. But then I thought, okay, I don't know. I mean, I got to stay on the scene too. I just couldn't give up the gig, you know, so it felt a little bit selfish and messed up to use all that travel. It just blew my carbon footprint for the entire year just to play one night on a festival. But it's, you know, it's a meaningful festival, but still. So, I don't know. These things I'm really struggling with, like how to navigate travel, how to navigate, you know, a new era in the world, but also in
Hmm.
our scene. Like what
Yeah,
should we be trying to build out ethically um, to support the music? And it's a long-term question we should be thinking about.
yeah, yeah. That, yeah, I think that that's like a nice open-ended ending actually here, which kind of provides more questions than answers.
Sure.
But it's true
That's
actually
the best
because
way. That's the best way to leave it. Yeah.
yeah,
Sure.
I mean, but it's true. Like what we touched today, like all these issues. It's like that's what we are talking about all the time, basically, with all the musicians.
I bet, man. I watched
Really,
a few of your
it's
things, and it's just when I hang out with musicians and we're like at the hang after the gig or in the van,
yeah,
I mean, sometimes we talk about harmony or whatever, but
yeah,
half the
it's
time, I mean, we have a very thoughtful community. People in our community are really creative and thoughtful, and they're talking about what does this music mean now? Who is
yeah,
it for? Why are we
yeah,
doing this? Where is it
yeah,
going? What can we be doing better in the world? How can we better build on the legacies we inherit of all these incredible, I mean, you think about what like the AACM and what
yeah,
all
yeah,
these,
yeah.
or going back earlier, early jazz, what those folks went through to get their music out,
True. Yeah,
what they had to do in their lives to get that music out. And this, we inherit all this. What are we doing with it?
mhm,
And I find people in our scene really, they get that each in their own different way. That's
yeah,
what we always end up going to these places in these conversations. And and it's exciting. People are doing amazing stuff. I feel like the music and the scene in a way has never been better creatively. It's just growing in so many directions with
mhm,
so many new kinds of people coming in, you know, people from all different backgrounds, and it's been super encouraging to see the amount of women leading bands and kind of coming into positions of influence and power within our scene, even though that's still an ongoing
yeah,
process. But we're in a different place with that than we were 10 years ago,
yeah,
for
yeah.
sure. And there's just a lot there's a lot of great things going on. So I'm hopeful, but there's a lot of big questions, man. So I
It is
appreciate
true.
you doing these podcasts. I looked at your thing. I thought, man, if I were gonna normally when someone invites me to do an interview, I go watch their prior ones. I thought this would take me like about a year of watching
Pro
podcasts every day to catch up to you.
Probably, man. Yeah.
You have interviewed like what, like 100 and something people, or
Oh
it's
no, it's like 500 now.
500 people. It's amazing, Samo. It's incredible. So
Yeah,
keep it going, man. It's great.
yeah.
And good.
We'll
Thank you.
continue this talk next time you come to Europe over a glass of wine or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to see
So,
you over there.
yeah.
Is that where you're in New York though, right?
No, I'm in Slovenia, in Europe.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah,
okay. You're
yeah,
in
yeah,
Slovenia. Wow.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I've
So,
never been there, but I've always wanted to go. It sounds amazing. So,
yeah, if you're gonna come to
yeah,
Europe, drop me a line. We have a guest room here with my wife and this
awesome.
room, so
Thank you. Well, it'd be
don't be
great to
shy.
do a gig
Just drop me a
sometime
line.
and
Yeah, yeah,
continue the conversation. But thank you for all
definitely.
that you're doing to build the scene, and I really
Yeah,
appreciate
thank
it.
you for sharing some of your thoughts and everything. So
Of course. Thank you,
cool, man.
Samo.
Cool,
All right.
Michael.